Hi everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Virtually, a brand new free virtual web accessibility and digital inclusion conference brought to you by Nomensa. We had a great day yesterday with 3 great presentations from Alistair Campbell, Chumi Kalu and Alicia Jarvis. We hope you enjoyed today as much as yesterday. First up today though, we have Alistair Duggin and Amani Ali of the accessibility team here at Nomensa. In their talk, Evolving Accessibility, Thinking Beyond Compliance to Inclusion, Alistair and Amani will explore the differences between compliance and inclusion and show you how accessibility can be used as a tool to improve design for everyone. As always, please say hello to each other in the chat. Make sure your chat settings are switched to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your messages. And do let us know if there are any issues with the stream. Also, please ask lots of questions using the Q&A function, and I'll get through as many as I can with them at the end. So yeah, without further ado, over to you, Al and Amani.
Hello. Thanks very much for joining us. We're really excited to be here and to talk to you about evolving accessibility and thinking beyond compliance and inclusion. So my name is Alistair Duggin. I'm a principal accessibility consultant here at Nomensa, and I've been at Nomensa for just over a year now. Previously, I've been head of accessibility at Government Digital Service, which is the home of gov.uk, which is generally considered an exemplar for accessibility. And I led the transformation of how central government approaches digital accessibility. I've also been an accessibility engineer at Apple and a principal web developer and accessibility lead at the BBC.
Hi, I'm Amani. I'm an accessibility consultant at Nomensa. I started my accessibility journey around 6 years ago at Atos, and then I moved to Nomensa, and so far it's been an exciting 4 years.
So today we're going to be talking to you about 4 main things. We're going to be sharing what we mean when we talk about accessibility, and that includes both compliance and inclusion. We're going to explain how inclusion differs from compliance, and we're going to look at how inclusion requires a different approach to compliance. We're also going to have a look at what COVID has shown us about accessibility. So, without further ado, so what do we mean when we talk about accessibility? So when I was head of accessibility for UK central government, I discovered quite quickly that accessibility means different things to different people, and that when people are using a different meaning than you are, it becomes very difficult to have effective and efficient discussions. So one of the first things that I did in the role was wrote a blog post to explain what I meant by digital accessibility. And I now start off most of my talks with a brief explanation of what I mean by the term, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So what is accessibility? Well, for me, accessibility is about designing and considering the full range of human diversity. It's about making sure that the widest possible audience can use what you design and build without them facing any barriers that make it difficult or impossible to use. The primary focus of digital accessibility tends to be on disability and ensuring that people with different physical and cognitive abilities are not discriminated against. It recognises that physical and cognitive capabilities vary hugely, and that there's a full spectrum of, for example, vision, from no vision to 20/20 vision, with everything in between. Similar for hearing. There's a huge variance in our mobility, our dexterity, our strength, and the types and amounts of pain we can experience, and also how everyone thinks and processes information is very different. If we don't consider this variation and proactively design for it, some people will inevitably be excluded, be left frustrated, and discriminated against. Accessibility makes human capability a functional requirement. So if you design and build something that doesn't work for people that have limited or no vision, that have limited or no hearing, that have limited diversity or diverse cognitive abilities, then what you designed and built can't be considered to be accessible. Accessibility also considers the wide range of assistive technologies that people use to extend their capabilities. So this includes things like text-to-speech software. So this includes screen readers, which read out content on that reads out content on the screen. Speech recognition software, which enables people to navigate and information through the power of speech. Magnification software that provides the ability to enlarge text and the user interface, and accessibility settings that are built into browsers and operating systems and applications that allow people to customize their experience to meet their personal needs. It also includes a variety of input devices that people rely on. So not just considering like a basic mouse or a touchpad, and it also considers the tools that people, the tools that provide alternative versions of audio-visual content, such as captions and audio descriptions. Accessibility empowers people to reap the benefits of digital media, and its goal is to achieve access for all and providing an equitable experience. So no matter what your needs are, if you're using a different input device than a mouse, if you're without vision and using a screen reader or an electronic braille device, if you have limited vision and require magnification or good color contrast or are colorblind, if you have limited or no hearing and require captions or transcripts, or if you have different cognitive abilities and require consistent and intuitive interfaces and clear content, accessibility is how your needs are met. And whilst accessibility is essential for people with disabilities, it's also really useful for everyone. Everyone's needs vary over time and in different situations, and you may not consider yourself to have a disability or an access need, but if your mouse breaks, if you're in a noisy environment or one that requires silence, if you have a broken phone screen or the glare of the sunshine makes the screen difficult to see, if you're stressed, hungover, or feeling the side effects of a vaccination, or if you have broken your arm or are holding a baby, or just prefer plain language, legible text, and the ability to make text a bit bigger, then you'll benefit from accessibility. However, if you ask someone to explain what accessibility is or how it's measured, the answer can vary hugely. Ask an accessibility professional what accessibility is, and they're likely to say it means that something meets the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and it's compatible with a range of common assistive technologies. If you ask a lawyer, they're likely to say that it meets legal regulations. And if you ask a user who's struggling to use a digital application, they're just going to say it needs to be easy for me to use. And that easy to use, that to me is the essence of what accessibility is. So this takes us kind of to the crux of this presentation, and that is that accessibility can be viewed through two kind of very different lenses, one of which is compliance and the other is inclusion. So what is compliance? So for digital accessibility, compliance is about meeting a requirement or a technical standard. For websites and mobile applications, the de facto standard is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they're relevant to every part of a digital user interface. This includes the content, the design, the code, and the functionality, and every member of a production team should be familiar with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as a matter of course. Alistair Campbell gave a fantastic talk yesterday, WCAG 2.2, what's new and what do you do with it, where he explained how the standards are created, how to use them, and what's coming in the next version. The illustration on the screen at the moment shows the WCAG creation process and how the guidelines are distilled are a distillation of expert and user research findings. If you didn't catch Alistair's talk yesterday, I definitely recommend that you watch it when it goes online this week. So, in essence, yeah, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are a set of guidelines or requirements that help you avoid common accessibility barriers. They're used as the legal standard for accessibility of digital content and interfaces in many countries around the world, including the UK, for the public sector accessibility regulations. As a result, it's the most common measure for accessibility and is therefore the basis of most accessibility testing. The process for testing against WCAG is generally to pick a representative sample of web pages and perform an expert review against the guidelines. For WCAG 2.1, this involves 50 testable success criteria that a web page can either pass, fail, or not be applicable to. The benefits of using a technical standard is that they're specific. So they provide a common set of requirements that you don't have to figure out yourself. And there's also a huge benefit in them being testable, measurable, and comparable. For their many strengths, they also have lots of weaknesses. So just by meeting the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines doesn't ensure that people with disabilities will have a barrier-free experience. A few things to be aware of are that WCAG focuses on access rather than usability. So something that is technically accessible can still be hard to use. It doesn't mitigate against assistive technology and browser bugs, which can cause unexpected barriers for users. And most importantly, it doesn't cover all accessibility. It doesn't cover all accessibility issues. So when testing for accessibility and when issues are found, they can usually either be categorized as a WCAG fail or as a best practice. In the reports that we create for clients when we audit their websites and applications, we make it really clear what issues are a fail and which are a best practice. We obviously encourage our clients to fix both types of issue, but from a compliance perspective, all you're actually required to do is to fix those that are a WCAG fail. Yeah, so I found that when I was working in government, there were lots of content designers that got quite excited by the accessibility regulations because they thought that they would finally have a stick that would kind of ensure that people would have to write using plain language, and it would prevent people from unnecessarily just having content in PDFs. But unfortunately, kind of both of these things are just considered a best practice when it comes to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, because you're not required to do these things to meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Other examples of things that would just be considered a best practice are some kind of pause heading hierarchies, although they're known to make it difficult for a screen reader to navigate the page via headings. It's not a problem to have multiple H1s or to skip levels. Equally, things like non-descriptive link text, such as click here, is not a WCAG fail if it is located within a sentence. And default focus styles that are pretty much invisible in some circumstances, again, are not the fail. Complex tables that can be incredibly difficult for screen reading users. These would only kind of, be considered the best practice to fix. And inaccessible interactive maps and charts don't have to be fixed if there's a basic text alternative. So as well as like WCAG not covering all barriers, there's also the issue that depending on what version and what level of WCAG you have to comply with, there are still also lots of known WCAG fails that you can choose to ignore. So as an example, in the US and Canada, compliance means only having to meet WCAG 2.0 AA. So this means that you can effectively ignore all WCAG 2.1 issues and you can ignore all AAA issues. So what this actually means is that you only actually have to test and pass 38 of the 78 success criteria to be compliant with WCAG 2.0. And these statistics are going to get even worse when WCAG 2.2 are released, because there's not going to be an immediate need for people to comply with it. what tends to happen with regulations is that it takes a long time to update regulations to the latest version of a standard. If we look at the USA and Canada, WCAG 2.1 has been the official latest version now for over 2 years, but their regulations, they haven't been updated to include that. So yeah, how long will it actually be until anybody needs to comply with WCAG 2.2? One of the, so then I'd like to bring to life what it means that if you're only having to comply with an older version of WCAG. So yeah, if you're complying with WCAG 2.0, it's absolutely fine to have controls that cannot be easily activated with speech recognition software, to have pop-over content that is impossible to use with a mouse, to have essential icons that can be hardly seen, and to have essential updates that are visually available but not announced by screen readers. It's also okay to have buttons that are too small for large fingers to activate. So legal regulations often have further exemptions. So this makes things even worse for disabled users because they tend to water down what's required by a technical standard. If we look at the public sector bodies accessibility regulations, which is the legal requirement in the UK for public sector bodies, there are exemptions with regard to non-essential PDFs published before September of 2018, videos published before September of last year, and maps if they have a basic alternative. There's also something called a disproportionate burden clause, which means that if an issue is deemed to be too expensive to fix when considering the size of the organisation, the resources that it has and the benefit to disabled users, then again, this doesn't need to be fixed if you are going to claim disproportionate burden. So yeah, so hopefully you can see using guidelines can be super helpful, but compliance doesn't mean that everybody will be able to use what you design and build. I'm going to hand over to Amani now, who's going to talk a bit about inclusion. I think you're on mute, Amani.
Sorry. Okay, thanks, Al. So what do we mean when we speak about inclusion? Inclusion is beyond, next slide, please. So inclusion is beyond disabilities. Inclusion is embracing everyone, irrespective of characteristics, so disability, gender, race, religious beliefs, sexual orientation, social class, etc. Inclusion is providing equal opportunities to everyone without any barriers. It's respecting people from all backgrounds and cultures. So we need to be mindful of people who may not have English as their first language or have low literacy skills. Inclusion is also ensuring everyone feels welcome. So content plays a massive part. It matters as images can really resonate with people. So if we take a look at the first image, we can see disabilities are embraced, but different types of people aren't. As for example, there's not a person of color, they're all the same size, weight, etc. And then the second image is embracing disabilities and almost everyone, as we have people of color, different disabilities, different height, different weight, different religious beliefs, etc. People tend to go to websites and apps and hope to see something that they can identify with. And these people really appreciate as well, as it shows that an effort has been made, because diversity is something that is slowly improving over the years. And for example, like English isn't my grandparents' first language. And as someone who's migrated from a completely different continent, abbreviations, specific jargon would be quite difficult to understand because they come from a completely different world. And if they're browsing through a website and they don't see a single person of color image, they wouldn't feel included or be able to relate or feel welcome, to be fair. And I'm sure there's other types of people who would be able to relate to this sort of issue. And as diversity has grown over the years, we've seen more and more content which includes different types of characteristics, which is great, but there is still more to be done. So how do we know when we're being inclusive? Well, true inclusion is when we've removed all barriers, discrimination, and intolerance, so which is an ideal world and that we should all strive to achieve. And one part of inclusion involves creating true accessibility. So rather than simply providing accommodations, a way to accomplish this is through universal methods, which includes designing products and environments to be usable to the greatest extent possible by everyone, regardless of age, ability, or anything else. And like good examples of this are Siri, Alexa, Google Home, which I'll talk about later on in greater detail. So what does it mean to really feel excluded? So if you put yourself in the shoes of a wheelchair user, so you try to take the train to work, but the lift doesn't work at the train station, you just end up, you can't access the platform. And then you try to look around, you ask for help, but there aren't any staff available. So you just end up feeling frustrated, you just call a taxi instead, which costs you 5 times the price of the actual train fare, and then you just end up being late to work. So it's like a great deal of frustration in that journey. So when we try to put ourselves in the shoes of a type of person who could possibly be excluded from a service or product, we just we end up realizing the potential barriers and obstacles that people can come across. So what does someone who's hard of hearing, someone with an ear infection, and a commuter on a crowded tube who forgot their earphones all have in common? They all would struggle to interact with audio content. So accessibility has the potential to improve millions of lives. And not only that, it would help the wider population too. And it has been. There are many products out there which are practical and life-changing for people with disabilities, but convenient and easier way of life for everyone else. So if we take a look at the mainstream technology, which is used by the wider population, but also improves the lives of those who are disabled, such as virtual assistants like Siri, Alexa, Google Home. These products are amazing for someone who may have some sort of visual or motor impairment. Rather than physically searching the web using a phone or laptop, people are able to request information by just using their voice. So Google Home, controlling your homeware, such as blinds, the heating, lights, TVs, with again, just your voice. For someone who can't move their upper body and physically switch off the light, it's just life-changing. So, and also being able to set reminders is super useful for those who may have cognitive impairments. They're reminding themselves to take a medicine at a certain time of day. And these products definitely give a sense of independence and empowerment back to people who previously have struggled to do simple things like control the lighting or close their blinds or just remember to take their medicine. And having a keyboard navigable website that can be used without the use of a mouse might be vital for someone with an upper body motor impairment, but it's also handy for someone with Asperger's or RSI. Screen readers for low vision is a great option for those wanting to absorb information while multitasking. And captions. So captioning for the hearing impaired is also useful for non-native speakers, people in noisy environments such as a crowded train. And captions also can help people digest information and maintain concentration. Like how many of you who don't have a hearing impairment prefer watching TV shows or films or even conference talks with captions on? I know I definitely do. I've also noticed social media platforms such as TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, they have slowly started to implement a caption feature, which is quite in demand, even by people who don't have a hearing impairment. Like I've seen under some videos, people are commenting where videos captions aren't provided and people are requesting for it. And then also ensuring content has clear, concise language and to assist those with learning and cognitive difficulties. It's also helpful to people who don't speak English and as a first language or have low literacy skills. How does inclusion differ from compliance? So what does it mean to be just compliant? Compliance is adhering to a regulation such as the Equality Act or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Compliance is having the mindset of doing the bare minimum. It's having the end goal of just meeting the law. Being compliant isn't inclusive. You're just focusing on a checklist rather than people and listening to users. It's limiting a service's potential. There's so much more that can be done to make it better and easier for users. Personally, I feel not enough organizations take the next essential steps of creating and designing services that promotes inclusion in all its variations and forms. So there's a lot of potential there. And a great deal of accessibility, digital accessibility does focus on enhancing what's already there or ensuring digital platforms are built and designed in an accessible way. But there's a lot more to accessibility than just guidelines and best practices. There's a huge opportunity for organizations to create digital experiences and journeys that prioritize people with accessibility needs. Whereas if you're compliant and inclusive, it's going above and beyond the legal minimum. You're doing more than your competitors. You're paving out brand new user experiences that put accessibility at the forefront. Being inclusive is focusing on everyone and everything. It's having the end goal of the service to be easy to use by everyone. You also have a competitive advantage if everyone can use the service. And being inclusive just basically means a good experience for everyone and just everyone's happy in the end. So this is a good example of being compliant, but not taking into account all types of needs. So, so the first image is where this will pass the guidelines. However, it's not inclusive. So if we take a deeper dive into it, if there's a problem with your application, the Home Office will call you, but there's no other communication options are provided. So somebody who has a hearing impairment, or they may have a stutter, somebody who may have anxiety, or they just don't want to speak on a phone, or even somebody who just has a busy life schedule and they just don't have time to attend the phone at all times. There isn't any option for that. Whereas the second image, as you can see, it's both compliant and inclusive. So users are able to decide whether they would like to receive a phone call or text message regarding the application. And in order to avoid this mistake, it's of excluding some users. If you were to analyze user requirements during the discovery phase, you'll be able to identify different needs and find solutions which would save extra costs and time. So rather than designing and rebuilding the service once an issue has been raised, and quite often it can work out pretty complicated, especially if a database service is involved, if the issue is found at the end. But I'll now hand over to Alistair to talk more about how to approach with inclusion in mind and to avoid any of these mistakes.
Yeah, so if you are striving for if you're striving for inclusion, it does require a different approach than kind of merely being compliant. So let's have a look at some of the things that are involved. So what tends to happen far too often, especially when people just have a compliance approach, is that something is kind of just designed and built as normal. Then towards the end, perhaps just before going live, the thing is tested. And then there's a big effort to try to remediate and fix accessibility issues that have been found. What tends to happen with this approach is, like, when accessibility hasn't been considered throughout the life cycle of the project, you are going to find a lot of issues at the end. Accessibility doesn't happen by accident. Inclusive things get created on purpose and by designing with inclusion in mind. What also tends to happen if you do leave your accessibility approach right till the end of a project, there is a really high chance that a team is just going to try to do the minimum to become compliant, rather than kind of using the lessons of what they've found, like the issues that they've found, and using them as a tool to kind of implement a better service. So yeah, so one of the most important things you can do if you're trying to be inclusive is around identifying exclusion as early as possible in your design process. As kind of Amani was talking earlier with the contact preferences, yeah, it's really easy to mock up a prototype that shows how you could collect contact preferences. But if you've already gone down the route of procuring the contact center, if the kind of the back-end systems are already in place, it's a huge amount of work to then kind of change the requirements at the end. So yeah, identifying needs at the start, much more efficient and will result in a much more kind of inclusive and usable service. Similarly, if within your website or your service, if you know there are PDFs, if you identify complex language, if you've got complex widgets like sliders and drag and drop, these are going to exclude some people. So it kind of makes sense to identify these early and figure out what to do at the start and design in better solutions from the beginning. A really good example is the use of interactive maps. So on the screen here, we've kind of got like a Google Maps style application where you can zoom into a map, you can drag the interface to find pins on the map that give information about flood warnings. There are definitely going to be some people that are excluded by this type of interface. Those that are blind or have low vision are going to really struggle with such a visual interface. But equally, people with mobility impairments may struggle to use the drag and drop or the zoom functionality. That's not to say that you can't or shouldn't use an interface like this. It will definitely be helpful and a good user experience for lots of your users. So what do you do in this kind of situation? Well, what you want to do is recognize at the start that this single solution will lead to some exclusion. So you want to kind of design in an alternative that ensures that there's another way to get to the same information. So on this screen here, we can kind of see the final design of the flood information service. And we can see that they've got the interactive app, but they also have a simple search box where you can put in a location, and then all of the flood information is provided as text next to the interactive app. So this ensures that people with accessibility needs, such as screen reader users or people with mobility issues, can still use this application. But it also means that kind of people with low digital skills that may not know how to zoom or pan and map, or people that are using a mobile device and have a very small screen, can still get a really good experience and get the information that they're after. So as well as kind of trying to identify exclusion as early as possible, a key part of inclusion is including people with a range of needs in your research, design, and your testing. And again, this should be throughout your project. So where possible, you should be including people with low digital skills, perhaps English as a second language, people that use a range of assistive technologies, people with diverse races and genders, and even people that are on low income. It's by designing with this kind of range of people that you're going to find barriers within your system, and you're going to be able to use this as a tool to help you design a much easier and better to use service. One of the other kind of key things that will help you on a journey to inclusion is to ensure that people in each role know what their responsibility is. And this doesn't just mean providing like a checklist of what they need to do to make sure that you're compliant. It's also about kind of including those kind of known best practices. So on the screen here, we've got an example of a spreadsheet that was created when we did some work with the NHS, where we not only kind of grouped common accessibility issues by interaction types that make it really useful and kind of easy to understand the types of barriers that people need to think about. But we also identified what was the responsibility of a content person, a graphic designer, an interaction designer, a front-end developer. So what you basically want is you want the people on your team to know what their responsibility is, and to avoid those issues when they're working on the system, rather than just somebody pointing out a problem at the end and you having to go back and fix it. Kind of in conjunction with making sure that different roles know what their responsibility is. The key tip for helping with inclusion is to make sure that you're checking for issues during each stage of your process, and that you are embedding the inclusive solutions that you come up with in your resources and your assets, like your brand guidelines and your pattern libraries, so that those kind of lessons and solutions can be easily used by other teams, and you're providing like a consistent experience across your digital estate. Yeah, really need to kind of move away from that thing of build, design, test, remediate. You kind of want this, you want to embed accessibility thinking into all of your processes and the resources and assets that you use to build your digital estate. The other thing that I kind of wanted to talk about is how one of the key parts of inclusion is prioritizing issues based on the impact that they have on people, rather than just through the lens of compliance. The fact is that not all issues are equal. You will have some issues that literally prevent or block somebody from completing an essential task. You will have other things that are an issue that fail the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but they actually have kind of very low impact on a user. What you want to be doing is you want to understand the impact of your issues on users, and you want to be prioritizing those that are blockers and the more serious barriers. What we do when we do our accessibility testing and provide reports is that for each issue that we find, we will add a severity level, so that it's really clear, like what is a blocker and what's severe. Like these are the things that you need to focus on first, and those things that are minor, even if they kind of like are required for compliance, they should be a lower priority than the blockers. I also want to call out how like compliance is actually like a really poor motivator for change. This is a really good, this is WebAIM's hierarchy for motivating accessibility change, that basically shows a pyramid of effectiveness, where at the bottom of the pyramid you've got guilt, followed by punish, require, reward, enlighten, and inspire. Like guilt is the worst way to motivate, to kind of be inclusive and make things accessible. Requiring, like compliance, that's better than guilt, but it's still not a massive motivator. The best thing to do is to kind of build empathy and to get people to understand and care about accessibility. If you can help people understand the impact that barriers have on people, and not just what is required to be compliant, you're going to get people that start to really care about accessibility and do what they can to avoid barriers and ensure that inclusion is considered within their products and services. Last bit that I want to talk about around kind of compliance and inclusion is that compliance is not a bad thing. Like, compliance it's an important step towards inclusion, but you need to realize that compliance is not the final goal. It is just a step on your journey. You've kind of got like a spectrum of accessibility approaches. You've got, like, at the one end, you've got like where there's no conscious design or thinking about accessibility, and like any accessibility happens by chance. The next level of maturity is around, like, they're just kind of like being like a few style type things. So this is where a lot of organizations are, where they consider things like color contrast and providing alternative text for images, but that's pretty much as far as their accessibility knowledge and their efforts go. Where compliance is around the next step, where there's this focus on following accessibility guidelines in order to achieve technical compliance. But where you really start to make a difference, where you really start to improve the experience, not only for disabled users, but for everyone, is where you're using accessibility as a tool to design better experiences. Compliance, not the end goal. Accessibility is an amazing tool to help you design better experiences. We need to kind of move away from this mindset that accessibility is a burden, or that it's a constraint in kind of creativity. It's an amazing tool to kind of help you design better things. I'll now hand back over to Ani.
Thanks, Al. So what has COVID actually shown us about accessibility? Well, it definitely has brought new users online. So while it has made the world more accessible than ever, but this doesn't mean everything is accessible. So if we take a dive into the statistics, which relate to a pre-COVID period, disabled people make up 50% of the global population. Some surveys of retail outlets found 20% don't really provide access to wheelchair users. Another survey found like 90% of businesses say they prioritize diversity, but only 4% were working on becoming more inclusive for people with disabilities. Another survey found that 75% of disabled people had to leave a shop or business because of the lack of understanding or awareness of their needs. And 70% employers had won 70% of the rulings over the past 2 years whether they could reject a employee's request to work from home as an accommodation for disability. However, if the same or similar surveys were to take place right now, the results would be completely different. Many of the solutions we've needed for this pandemic are the same solutions, like remote working, online learning, having certain services available online via the store aisles that disabled people have been requesting and demanding for years. I guess people with disabilities still don't really feel heard. While it's taken a pandemic for a change, these changes happened ever so quickly, but the demands from such people over the years were hardly met or taken seriously. One great example is how stores have altered their layout and design to cater for the social distance rule. So if gaps between store aisles were wider, as they are meant to be for wheelchair users and others, then everyone today would be able to socially distance. And we've seen roadworks going on for widening pavements in areas where it's a street full of shops. So if pavements were wider in the first place, people could walk past each other without breaking the rules. And if all doors had already opened automatically to help people with mobility impairments, it would be much easier for people with some type of disabilities to move freely. But it also means that no one would have the need to touch the doors, which would mitigate the risk of contracting the virus. So Again, COVID has shown that it's taken a pandemic for a change, but the changes aren't explicitly for people with disabilities. It's just to align with government guidelines, and they just happen to be extremely beneficial for people with disabilities. More and more supermarkets are providing an online service to cater for those quarantining who are quarantining at home. Everyday tasks like buying groceries are particularly challenging for people who can't leave the house or need assistance at the store. And during the first stage of the pandemic, retail and food stores were closed for a number of months. And in that time, majority of the services which could be found in store were now moved online. And food delivery services such as Uber Eats, Deliveroo, Just Eat, traffic has increased massively during the pandemic, and users are required to use a website or app to order food. But what if the platform isn't accessible? Before the pandemic, people could just call up and order to go to the store, call up and order, or just go to the store. But because the pandemic, it's been encouraged to order food online rather than to call because of high volume. And for many people, online grocery shopping may never have received a second thought. Instead, it's been a matter of necessity almost overnight. So for some people, this can be a shock to the system and can cause quite great difficulty, especially if they've never done it before and they have to work out how to do it. And if food delivery services, if their platforms aren't accessible, then people with disabilities who rely on assistive tech will find it very difficult to interact and order food just like everyone else, or even just order groceries as well. So people have been getting a smallest taste of what people may have to endure every day in terms of making the world work for them. People's previous way of life was taken from them by them, and in this case it was by the virus. So the onus is on them to adapt to a brave new world. And so people are now experiencing what it's like to stay at home for something that's beyond their control. So naturally, we all want equal access to be able to participate in society like how we used to. So people aged over 70 were told overnight to avoid social contact as much as possible. And in the UK, I think people aged over 75 represent over half of the population who don't use the web at all. Some may not have a disability, but many may encounter some sort of barrier to accessing digital services platforms, such as age-related impairments like declining eyesight or cognition impairment, or having zero assistance because they're shielding, so nobody is around them to help them. Especially some of these elderly, they have previously for COVID, they had care workers or carers coming in, or some family members helping them, but if they're shielding, then they're left to fend for themselves, basically. So a recent study took place where around 27% of students enrolled in a UK university were unable to access online learning during the lockdown, and students with disabilities, those who came from a lower income background, and even foreign students were most likely hit with the challenges. And as schools, universities, colleges were closed for a while, and the lack of access to in-person teaching could have been a setback for many students. And while it can be beneficial for some people with disabilities to learn online from home, it can be challenging for others, especially if platforms aren't compatible with assistive technologies such as voice recognition or screen reading software. So this can cause major frustration as students who can't access the platforms with their assistive tech. They may feel like they're falling behind on their work, and they're not having the equal learning opportunities as their other peers. And a classroom environment is where you'll find all sorts of different characteristics of people. So it's vital ensuring students are part of the community, that they don't feel left out, and they can gain the same education as their peers without any sort of barrier. So there is still a lot more to be done to ensure virtual learning is both inclusive and accessible. So COVID-19 has serves as a learning opportunity for how organizations can effectively accommodate different needs. It is possible, as we have seen with a number of drastic changes that have taken place to align with current guidelines. And we've all seen how important and reliant we are with digital platforms. So there is a greater need to make them inclusive so that they're suited to everyone. And when we exclude people, there is a great deal of unfairness, especially when digital is currently the way forward and will continue to be like that. So the more inclusive your service is, the more people can use it, and the more exclusive your product is, the lower number of people can use it. So in theory, this doesn't really make any business sense. You have a greater competitive advantage if you start implementing inclusivity early on, and hopefully other organizations may see as a role model and follow your footsteps. So inclusion leads to better products, a better way of living, and just happier people in general. So if you feel like you're not doing enough to be inclusive, now is definitely the time to start. And I hope you enjoyed our talk. So thank you all for listening. And if anyone has any other questions, we're more than happy to answer them.
Brilliant. Thanks, Amani. What a great presentation.
Thank you.
Really, really useful. Lots of things to think about there. Yeah, we do have time for a few questions. So if anyone does have any, then please submit them using the Q&A function just at the bottom of your Zoom window. We've got a couple in already. So we've got a question here from Jakub, who says, great talk, thanks. What's your recommendation to organizations around the cognitive guidelines? Do these and WCAG take a more WCAG 3.0 approach and look at the journeys and include more users?
Yeah, so there's not like in WCAG, certainly in WCAG 2.1, there's there's a lot of focus on things that don't relate to cognitive abilities. Like there are some things there, but like if you look at something like where gov.uk and the NHS have been real kind of exemplars, they have really tried to focus on kind of keeping things simple and easy to use. They kind of prioritize kind of like including users in user research when they're designing things. And yeah, it's like trying to ensure that the most important thing is that somebody can easily complete a task. When you take this kind of task-based approach and when you're kind of focusing on ease of use, this is going to help everybody, but it's going to be really helpful to kind of for people with cognitive impairments. So yeah, if you're so focusing on cognitive impairments, like compliance will do some bits to help you with cognitive impairments, but nowhere near as much as taking like a truly inclusive approach.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, so next question we have that's been submitted anonymously. They say, I am researching websites, in brackets, not apps, specifically designed for an audience of cognitively disabled people and their carers. Has Nomensa done such work or know of such websites that we can look at and review?
That is a that's a question. Amani, are you aware of any stuff we've done in particular around cognitive impairments?
I'm sure if whoever submitted the question wants to drop us an email, we can.
Yeah, that's probably.
Yeah, we can have a dig into that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Let's take that one offline and we'll have a think.
So we have next question here from Bob, who's asking how much pressure is applied to websites with poor accessibility? I'm guessing from a compliance perspective.
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, that's a really good question. So I think like if you compare the UK to the States, it's very different. Like in the States where there's a huge amount of kind of like litigation and those sorts of things, there's a real pressure from a legal risk and financial risk point of view to make sure that things are accessible. Like if you see things like Domino's kind of got sued and those sorts of things. In the UK, there's less of a litigation kind of culture. So, but something to bear in mind, like with the public sector regulations that have come into place, government digital service they are actively monitoring the public sector, and each year are selecting a proportion of websites to audit to find out if they are meeting the regulations. Some of this is kind of like based on random sampling. There is others where people have made complaints about the accessibility of services. Then there's a really good chance that I guess those websites will be included in that yearly monitoring process. It's still kind of yet to be seen, like what the real consequences are of a website not meeting the regulations. But yes, it'll be kind of interesting to see how that advances. I think like what tends to happen, I think a lot of the times when organizations do get taken to court for accessibility reasons in the UK, things kind of tend to get agreements get made outside of court, and the findings aren't kind of publicized. So I think there's probably a lot more that goes on in that space than what people realize. So on the surface, it doesn't look like there's much consequence for not making your website accessible. But yeah, certainly with the regulations, there's kind of increased kind of vigilance and looking out for non-compliance.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. So we have one here from Zoe, who asks, do you find digital accessibility maturity models include inclusivity, or is it more a compliance approach? Any thoughts on those approaches and models?
Yeah, I guess it depends who's created the model and what their definition of accessibility is. It kind of like, it goes back to think like lots of accessibility professionals do just consider accessibility to be about compliance with WCAG and compatibility with assistive technology. So if that's the viewpoint that you're coming from, the maturity models can kind of be around meeting that. Yeah, and I'm trying to think. So like within government, we kind of set up a maturity model that was based on the business disability what's it called? Business disability, I forgot what they're called. They had a maturity model, and yeah, to be honest, at the higher kind of ends of the maturity level, you kind of do tend to see things like including users with access needs as part of the research. But often, like in accessibility maturity models, it normally is kind of around disability, kind of rather than wider inclusion of thinking about different like socio-economic groups, or because there are lots of reasons why people can face barriers when using your website or your service, not just due to a physical or a cognitive ability. So yeah, I think generally maturity models tend to focus on disability. They go beyond compliance, but there is a definite focus on disability where I think certainly like, especially in these times of pandemics and those sorts of things, like you just want to make sure you don't have any barriers for any users, irrespective of if it be a physical, a cognitive, a socio-economic need.
Awesome, thanks, Al. Yeah, I know we've got a few more questions, but unfortunately that's all we've got time for. If anyone would like to get in touch with us, we'd be more than happy to answer them. Or you can get in touch with Al or Amani on Twitter. I'd like to say thanks to everyone for tuning in. Up next, we have Gigi Etienne from What 3 Words with her talk, Bridging the Gap Between Physical and Digital Accessibility. That's taking place at 1 p.m. UK time. and we hope to see you there. Again, thanks Al and Amani for a fantastic presentation. And yeah, we hope to see all of you back at 1 p.m. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.